Gotham. Good minds discuss events. Great minds discuss ideas.
Great minds discuss ideas. The great mind I'm here with today is Captain Josh Blackburn. And we're going to jump right into it. We're going to just jump right into it and talk about woundedness. We talked a little bit about it last week. That is one of my, I'm going to write a book about everyone's 5 sermons. I'm sure there's already a book about it, but
who knows?
One of mine is that woundedness, vulnerable is derived from the Latin word vulnus, which is wound, which gets back to the idea that most people connect through pain, through woundedness. Woundedness is different than pain, isn't it?
I mean, I suppose we could differentiate, but at some point, is it? I mean, I guess pain generally is pointing towards a wound, right? Something that's not operating correctly. But I mean, if we think of wounding as this depends on how you think of wounding, right? Being the victim of an insult, like we think of so if I use the phrase traumatic brain injury, right? Wounded brain injury. The Greek word trauma it's the Greek word for wounded. And, but that might be a good instance of where you don't, and, you may not feel pain in your brain because you don't have pain receptors there, except on the outside. Maybe you have some on the inside. I'm not that much of a medical guy. But what flows from that becomes painful.
True. Yeah. Psychological pain. But I guess when I think of a wound, I think of more than just pain. I think of protection, when a dog has a wound and will not let you get near his foot if it's, broken or bleeding. He won't let you get near it. There's a protection aspect to it.
Yes. Yeah. Right. All animals get kind of protective about being wounded. We compensate. And by compensate, it's like adapting in a temporary fashion, right? If one foot's bad or one knee's bad, your other knee starts compensating, and
right.
If that knee heals up, it might work out okay. But if you compensate too long, it actually creates more wound, more pain.
You see that a lot in football. A lot of times, somebody hurts one knee. They work so hard on that knee, the other knee gives out when they get back on the field. But in that protection, you were saying something about how because woundedness is what we connect, is where we go deep with each other as humans. We often live in shallow waters with each other because nobody wants to go into that.
Well, sure, everyone pretends as if they're not.
They're not wounded. They're not.
Well, and we live in an age that's actually kind of strange in the sense that so I don't back away from using this word trauma as it relates to woundedness. One, because I'm more of a Hellenophile, so I like Greek words more than Latin words. But vulnerability works, right?
Yeah.
But we do live in an age where the notion of psychological trauma is there's a larger. I don't even want to use the word awareness. I don't even want to use the word understanding. But that word trauma gets used a lot.
Yeah.
Traumatized, traumatic.
Overused? Would you say overused?
Well, it's difficult because I have a deep respect for this word, and so I think it gets used a lot, but I think it gets used rather flippantly.
Yeah.
And it often gets drawn into the problems that come around identity politics, and in labeling for the purposes of creating groups, rather than everybody on this planet, if you're a human being, has been traumatized, will be traumatized, and is a traumatizer.
Yeah.
That's, yeah. So from a Christian perspective, it's like everyone here is a sinner, and everyone here will be the recipient of somebody's sin. And what does sin do? Sin wounds.
Yeah, well, I think that that's the whole thing. I don't really think there is a such thing as sin in itself. It's anything. It's just anything can be sin when it wounds, and it wounds in a way that in specific ways, and those specific ways, illuminate the sins or darken. But and there is a darkening because of the hiding that we do, hiding that I'll say that I do when I am protecting that wound, protecting that trauma. Trauma to me, it's interesting the different feelings I have for both the words. Woundedness to me, I think of animals, a wounded animal. Trauma, I think of violence, which is so human violence. Trauma, I think of human violence. I think of shaking in a way that breaks.
Yes.
Shaking and breaking. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And the whole creation suffers. Paul says, right? Groans as a result of human violence.
Yeah.
Subjected to this state.
I've been thinking about what you said about men last time. I saw you got some people were a little, there was some.
I did go back and see some of those comments, but just in brief.
Yeah. There's just some brief ruffling of the feathers.
Yes.
And or more. I don't know. But I did think about men in particular, because actually, it's funny because a couple of days later I interviewed another friend of mine, Jovan, and he's a lot more into the he's a lot more on the side of the I would say Andrew Tate camp, and but so it was interesting to me because I've known you a long time, and I would not ever characterize you as a chauvinist. You and especially lately, I feel like you have had more of softening towards the other side, right? Like when it comes down to politics, you're much more introspect, I think. Would you say? You've always been pretty introspect.
I guess when it comes to politics, I don't know. I guess I'm trying to think of the technical term that really. I'm something of let's technically think often considered a quietist. In other words, like I'm on the sideline. I on the one hand, it's kind of like I feel like we have a responsibility. I say we the church have a responsibility to this world, and on the other hand, we don't. I have no interest in fighting any culture wars beyond. One, I'm not interested in fighting any culture wars. Period. I am interested in like culture building and culture preservation, but I think warring against the pagans is a waste of time. You don't war against them. You just build a city on the hill and let it be. So yeah, I guess I don't get all riled up around the politics of the world. and I use that in a very term of art sense world. The current world system as it is, let it burn, because that's what it wants to do to itself.
But
You know, so but
And-
you don't become salt by raging against the machine.
right, I agree.
Yeah, mixing metaphors here, but yeah. So yeah, I've always been a little bit kind of quietist, and you know, it's like, let's look inside, let's tend our own garden, let's make sure that, you know, we're pulling our own weeds. You know, I think one of the reasons, you know, going back to kind of where we started in this conversation about how men show up in relationships. Well, one of the reasons why, in my opinion, you know, we have the marriage and the culture war issues around monogamy and marriage and gender roles has been a failure of men to be men. We've bought into this industrialized vision of masculinity rather than a biblical vision, rather than, you know, an older view of civilization. We've bought into the machine, and perpetuating its ideals, the blatant and nasty materialism of it. You know, man as protector and provider. You know, those. It's like, but protector in what way?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what that really has turned into is spreading. And again, this shows sort of my quietist and non-interventionistic sort of mentality. We have spread blood and treasure across the globe, at the expense of the lives of young men. And it's all fun and games until, you know, you get sent to some place on the other side of the planet, compliments of the U.S. government on a world tour, and you leave your friends die there, and you're still trying to make sense out of it. Like me, I've met guys that are still trying to make sense out of it 20 years later, 15 years later. Like, why were we there? It's not always clear. And, you know, the rhetoric, I think, is a little paper thin, but that's just, you know, because at the end of the day, who does it benefit to have these kinds of wars? The people that make bombs and the people that make guns.
Interesting.
So,
yeah, well, it's funny because you were one of the first people that I ever heard. Well, yeah, one of the first people I ever heard say, "Why are we deposing?" It was Saddam Hussein. Like,
yeah, I was in my
why?
small little circle. Yeah, I was a little vocal about that. I mean,
Yeah,
it's difficult because, like, I can understand taking punitive action against you know, when we went in Afghanistan, but it's challenging when you get into regime change and all that kind of stuff. But Iraq, that on its face, I had a hard time, and but even before, like when Colin Powell was trying to make the case for weapons of mass destruction, it was like, this seems really sketchy. That we're going to mobilize this kind of force again for regime change.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember you. I don't know if we were texting back then or if it was email or just on a phone call. But I remember that you saying, like, it's crazy that we're, you know, going in and taking down this, to supplant it with who and what and for what reason. And I remember thinking, at the time I was, you know, pretty pro Bush and stuff, and so I took offense at that. But the more I thought about it, and over the years, of course, you've proven to be right. And so what is it though? What core value, core stump speech, or, you know, core principle in your life brought you to that idea
of, like, quietism? Or
not interventionism, you know, quietism.
well, I think, I don't know. For me, it's always, I think it's implicit in the New Testament, and it's challenging because, again, it's like being part of the world, but not of this world. It's if I'm going to put I put the accent on not trying to put the accent. Most of the time I'm actually very much of this world. I'm a very worldly person, but putting the accent on not of this world. At the end of the day, there's a finite amount of time, space, and energy that any human being has, and the question becomes, where do you put it? Do you put your treasure in heaven, or do you put your treasure on earth? And that can sometimes be a false dichotomy. On the one hand, like I want to put this almost in a dialectical tension. On the one hand, it can be a false dichotomy, but on the other hand, it's kind of like, no, it really does kind of show up, like where your attention, where your space, where your time goes.
So in that particular situation, were you reacting against other Christians? I guess I'll say I get the sense that your reaction was against other Christians because you weren't trying to be
Iraq
part of the
was
conversation.
Iraq was a little bit different because I was young at the time, and I think at that particular point in time, the question really for a lot of young men is like, well, do I go and participate in this thing?
Yeah.
My problem with it, and this is one of the issues that I had around with the military, it's like, once you sign on, you don't get to choose where you go. So if it was like, we'll send you to Afghanistan because we're going to put, a judicial smackdown on Al Qaeda. Okay. I mean, I can get behind some of the rationale for that, but Iraq was a different story. And time has proven me to be true on multiple levels. So from a Christian perspective, the thing that people did not understand about Saddam Hussein as a dictator was that he was a Ba'athist. His party protected Christians in a country that was ripe for civil war, which proved to be true. And then when we invited jihad from every Islamic country that bordered that place. And it has resulted in the deportation and death of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi Christians.
Yeah. So
from a Christian perspective, like politically, that was the most asinine and absurd move our country could make.
And so it seems like, or I remember you being just frustrated with people like me and other Christians that were sort of cheering on, deposing and taking out this guy. Who was, and I remember you saying that he protects Christians, or at least his
party
presence
does.
there protects Christians. Yeah. He wasn't particularly interested in Christians, but his party does. Yeah.
It was just the kind of government that kept that territory regulated and relatively at peace. And we all saw now historically what happens when you remove that kind of strong man out of his place. It goes crazy. You get like it just went off the chain. In fact, I was talking with some folks over the weekend who work for Blackwater, and in fact one of them is an Orthodox deacon and has an icon that was given him by the cook that worked in their compound. And that family literally, like, they would get the mark of the Nazarene on their house, and they were deported and probably murdered,
killed. Yeah. Wow.
So I mean, you're talking about like the challenging thing is like you have to have a handful of critical pieces of information to kind of connect the dots and go, if this happens and this happens and this happens, then this will probably happen. And most people weren't connecting the dots. But as a general rule, I loathe the idea of us getting involved abroad in military operations for what are often put out as in the American interest. And part of that is not just a Christian thing, but even like an early American mindset around, that most of the founding fathers were not interested in intervening in European conflict. Now, occasionally we did, the Barbary, the Marines and the Barbary pirates, stuff like that. It was very strategic. It was small. Almost you could use the term surgical. They weren't regime change kinds of actions. We only start to get into that a little bit later. Maybe that probably starts in the Mexican War. We start to get that feel, but it really kicks off with the Spanish-American War. And it hasn't stopped since. As far as what it means to be American, but
the idea.
We're scope creeping.
What's that?
So we're scope creeping. I want to go back to talk about being wounded, but quietism. Yeah, I don't speak about that stuff too much.
Yeah. Well, I think it came up because, because you were the first person to ever talk to me about that, and the idea of, I do think it comes back to men being able to hold each other accountable. The idea of accountability, but not like this, ledger. Instead of a ledger of accountability, it's a account, keeping account of, like an account is in a story, right? Like giving account rather than keeping account. Does that make sense? And in this accountability, men holding each other, not going back to a ledger, but holding or let's say lifting each other to the idea of getting the inside out.
Yeah, and I think for me, the inside out, being intimate, being vulnerable is a means to an end, and I think I can tie together some of this quietism and this general cultural desire for peace, and from men. Here's the thing that's difficult about men. Like we traumatize more people than anybody else, and ourselves. So going back to this notion of accountability, and even like talking forth a chronicle, it begins for me. It's like, in what way can men help other men and themselves be gentle men? When we think of that phrase gentleman, we often think of like civilized or dapper or successful, but at the heart of it, it's like gentility, civilized. But at the heart of that is the notion of gentleness. It implies, maybe not on its face, but we were talking like we're putting two things together that are actually quite often opposites. Men are quite infrequently not gentle with themselves or with others. And that's quite a problem. It's a problem that people don't talk about in a way that's like, look, guys, this is a problem. When 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 women is physically assaulted or sexually assaulted, it's almost exclusively by men.
Yeah.
Men kill themselves and other people at staggering rates. Not to mention all kinds of self-abuse when it comes to drugs and alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. So,
but I feel though that like the answer that we hear in society today is, well, that's toxic masculinity, and so we need to castrate that.
Well, that would be to emasculate masculinity, which doesn't make any sense. Like, here's the problem. This is the way I describe it to parents that I work with clinically. What you have is an adolescent person with testicles, which means they've got all this new testosterone surging through their body. It's a thing. You have to deal with it. It's a biological fact. It's a very useful hormone.
I was going to say, and very useful, I might
The
add.
problem is You can have too much of a good thing, or you can have a good thing and not know how to use it.
Yeah.
So, again, holding some of these things in tension, where it's like, it's work to be a gentleman. Being a gentleman does not come accidentally most of the time.
Right.
It just doesn't. Didn't for me. I'm still working on it.
Me too.
But
I mean, we're running out of time. So what is, as men too? No, just kidding. But me and you running out of time. So what is it that what is something that we can take today, you and I, into the day, an idea that we come back to, that we hold, to help us do this, to be more gentle? Because I'm afraid I go to the extreme. I do run to the extreme of like, well, I just gotta cast. It's that binge purge, just castrate it off. But there is something in me that I need, that testosterone. I need that testosterone to keep me competitive, not competitive against other people, but against myself. To keep me pushing when it hurts, to keep me that extra piece to keep me doing the hard things. I think testosterone is very useful for that. I was thinking about that the other day.
Oh, it's a biological component of all these things. It's correlate. That's tricky. I think intention setting is always a good practice of like reminding ourselves, what are we actually shooting for, right? Like if I play with words, it's like when we think about being castrated, it's like, well, maybe docile. I don't know if that goes far. Like men need to be overtly docile. It's like, well, maybe not. I don't know. I'm rather fond of the notion of gentility and gentleness, but it's a manly gentleness. It's the gentleness of a man. That's what makes it what it is. So setting a clear intention, always a great idea. And since I'm not fond of reductionism and getting stuck out at the points of the pendulum, cultivating the virtue of discretion, that every moment is going to require a different attitude, a different stance, a different approach. And so the virtue of discretion is and wisdom is this thing that we need to know, is this the moment to maybe even be docile? Or is this the moment to be violent? There are moments to be violent. They're very rare, extremely rare. But it takes discretion. It takes wisdom to know what's needed now. But we don't have a whole lot of discussions in this culture about discretion and wisdom. So.
I looked up the definition, and it says the second one is moderate in action, effect, or degree, not harsh or severe. But that moderation aspect of the definition gave me an idea, and that is I think it would help me as a man to think of it less of suppressing myself.
Yes.
And more as a strategy and a moderation. Like this is the ingredient I need right now is not violence. Is not control. The ingredient I need right now. Well, and it doesn't have to be like is sweetness, right? Like maybe gentleness is.
You don't have to be saccharine.
Right,
overly sentimental.
Like maybe I just need to be watchful or observant, in my quietness, quiet and that can, I mean, the subtle complexity of our approach, I think, can be helpful. We're not just, well, we're either raging or we're in sweetie pies, you know.
Yeah. And that's one, this virtue of, I was just trying to remember, it's St. John Cashin in his conferences that there's a dialogue between him and a monastic around discretion, this notion of discretion as the master virtue. Because some situations are going to require different things, but it's going to require discretion and wisdom to know which path to take. And as a man, like, we have to factor in this biology piece, right? There's a social cultural component where it's like everyone, guys just need to be like women, and it's like, well, I don't think that's going to work. I just don't. It screams against things that you can't change. You can't change biology.
Right.
Fundamentally, you can't. Superficially, you can, but fundamentally, it's just not happening. So you got to work with it. Right. So that, and when you bring up suppression, it's like you can't suppress it. It will come back swinging. Suppression, repression, generally as a rule, is a strategy that sometimes works, but most of the time causes bigger issues.
Well, it works temporarily. It's a temporary.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a great temporary strategy, right? Like, if you're raging, it's probably a good thing to suppress that, and then go to the corner somewhere and deal with it.
Well, Josh, thank you for joining me today. I think we brought it back. I think we got it, and I think
all over the place.
It made me think that we can't. I forget how much of a historian you are. So we have to I think we need to go into some of these history things, and not just always keep it on the psychological side of things with you and I. But we were able, I think, to bring it back to the idea of a different kind of control.
Yeah.
It's a controlling ourselves, not like this, but controlling ourselves with a sense of moderation and tactics. I don't know. That's all I got. But
away.
I know you got to go, and I appreciate you tuning in. Everybody, Verda. Oh, hey, Verda tuned in. Verda Phillips. Thanks, Verda. And others. And I thank you for your conversation, brother.
You're welcome, brother.
May we be gentle today.
Practice it. Be a gentle man.
Yeah. Well, bye, brother.